Hello everyone and welcome back. In the last lesson, we wrote our first security rule. And what we did was we wrote it on this read. But if you remember from the first lesson, I mentioned that read actually breaks into both get and list. Get allows users to fetch specific user document reference objects individually. List allows users to get the entire collection. In our case, we never want a user to be able to get all of the users we have stored in our database because no user ever should be able to access any of that sensitive information. So what we can do in this lesson is actually start getting more granular. So what we want to do is we want to change this allow read to allow get, meaning that we only want users to get specific documents based on that same conditional that we've already written. But let's just test this again in our simulator with our new rule. We keep the same and we make sure that our UID matches the actual ID of the user we're trying to fetch, and we run our simulated get call. And here we'll see that our read is the same. So this is perfectly fine. But with these more granular rules, what we're going to actually explore is writing additional rules for the actual write method as well. So we saw that there was read, and read breaks into get and list, but there's also write. And write breaks into create and update as well as delete. In our case, we never want users to be able to delete any user objects inside of our database, so we're just not even going to write a rule for that. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to say allow create if the requested user actually is authenticated in the first place. So here we're going to say request.auth does not equal null. Now you might be wondering, how are we able to actually create a user object if we're expecting them to have an auth object already? Well, if you remember, the authentication actually happens in the authentication tab. The users that we're writing to exist inside of our database. They're actually two separate things. This auth object is not controlled by us as far as it belonging on the request keyword goes. The request keyword would have the authentication as long as the user has authenticated using the authentication library that we've been leveraging inside of our code base with that Google pop-up or that email password sign-in. That all happens using the authentication library. The authentication library allows the request to know whether or not they're authenticated in the first place. So this makes perfect sense because we only want a user to be able to create a user object if in the first place that auth exists. So here what we're saying is that we only want users to be able to create something if they've authenticated already. You can get even more granular by saying that if there is a UID, which you can expect there to be, what we want to say is that only then are they allowed to actually write against some specific user ID path. Because here, if you remember in our code base, we actually write right against the path in the first place. We use the UID to represent the document reference's place inside of our database. If we look at the code for our Firebase utils, and we look at our create user profile document, we see that what we're doing is that as long as the user auth object exists, we are getting the user reference document object at user/UID. So here, even though the object doesn't exist yet in our database, Firebase is smart enough to know that we want to potentially make an object here. So our rule here is actually going to be the exact same as our rule above. And now, if we want to actually group these together, we can say allow get or create using the same ruling. A user is only allowed to create an object if they've authenticated, as well as that object that they're making is the one that belongs to their own authentication in the first place. And now we can actually test this out as well. So instead of simulating a get call, I'm going to simulate a create call, and I'm going to create against some random string here. If I'm not authenticated and I run this, I should be denied because I'm not authenticated. If I am authenticated, but I'm trying to create an object for some place in the database where the ID doesn't match the ID of my authentication, meaning that I'm authenticated, sure, but I'm trying to make 50 different users. I should not be able to do so. So here I'm still using that old UID that I had. But here I'm trying to make it against some new place in the database. If I were to run this, I should also fail. So this way, just because a user is authenticated doesn't mean they can suddenly spam and create multiple user objects in our database. However, if the UID does match, then if I run, I should be allowed to. This makes sense. If I'm trying to authenticate for the first time, then is the only time when our application should be allowed to make an actual new user document object inside of our database. Now, what's great about this rule is that it's pretty applicable in many cases with user objects in the first place. If in the future, a user wanted to update their profile in some way, let's say we built a feature where we allowed users to update information on their user object. We could do so by either adding some update field here, because this would pretty much be the same thing. We only want users to be able to update their own object, and they can only update it if they're authenticated and the UID matches their user ID. So by adding update, this will work. Alternatively, we can just group create and update together into write. So just like that, we've kind of gone around and combined two back into one, as long as it suits the needs of what rules that we're writing. This really just shows the power and flexibility of Firebase and these security rules. It allows us to get more granular if we need to, and it allows us to get very specific and more broad if we wanted to as well. We just have to keep in mind and really think about what it is that we're trying to do with these security rules. But that's really all that is to it. And with that, we've written our users collection security rule. And now that we've secured our users database, what we've learned just now is going to be pretty much identical to the same things we're going to apply to any other database that we want to encrypt. So we're going to do this with our collections database in the next lesson. So I'll see you in the next lesson.